The Department Store Hangman. By Keikichi Osaka. I believe it was a German film. In any event, this happened some 2 months after I met Kyosuke Aoyama at a private screening. At 5:30 one morning, after receiving a telephone call from my newspaper, I was racing in a taxi with Kyosuke toward our department store to cover a reported suicide by jumping that had occurred earlier that morning. Kyosuke was 3 years my senior. He had once held a distinctive position as an unconventional director at a certain film company, but he had been unable to accommodate either the general tastes of Japanese audiences or the company's commercialism. He had therefore retired from the film world and was living quietly as an independent researcher. Industrious and tenacious, he often astonished me with a sensitivity as sharp as a scalpel and an abundant imagination. At the same time, he ranged across every field of science with meticulous insight and an extraordinarily lucid analytical intelligence, amassing a vast store of valuable knowledge. Early in our friendship, I had schemed to put Kyosuke's astonishing learning to use in my own professional activities. As the days passed, however, that ambition turned into boundless admiration and respect. Before long I gave up my lodgings in Hongo and moved into the apartment house where he lived, taking the room next to his. Such was the irresistible fascination that Kyosuke Aoyama held for me. At 6:10, we arrived at our department store. The place where the body had fallen was an alley on the northeast side behind the store. On the blood-stained asphalt, nearby shop employees, laborers, and early morning passers-by were looking up at the roof and talking noisily among themselves. The body had been temporarily placed in a storeroom belonging to the purchasing department, and the authorities had just completed their examination. When we entered, my cousin, recently promoted to chief judicial officer at a certain police station, welcomed us warmly and gave us the facts with a trace of pride. This was not suicide, he said, but murder by strangulation. The victim was Tatsuichi Noguchi, a 28-year-old unmarried employee who worked the register in the jewelry department. Near the place where his body had landed lay an expensive pearl necklace set with several diamonds. It was one of 2 pieces that had disappeared the day before yesterday from the jewelry department where Noguchi worked. A patrolman had discovered both the body and the necklace at 4 that morning. Finally, my cousin added that he himself was in charge of the case. When he had finished, we obtained permission to approach and take in the body, vivid as a poppy blossom. The skull had been shattered. The horribly distorted face was ghastly with clotted, black-red blood. Savage strangulation marks encircled the neck, the earth-colored skin there was torn in several places, and a little blood had soaked into the collar of the victim's terrycloth pajamas. Across the chest, exposed for the examination, ran another earth-colored welt at an eerie diagonal, and one of the left ribs along that sinister line had been brutally snapped. Countless shallow abrasions remained on exposed parts of the body, the palms of both hands, the shoulders, the underside of the jaw, the elbows, and 2 or 3 tears could also be seen in the terrycloth pajamas. While I recorded the dreadful scene in my notebook, Kyosuke boldly touched the body itself, examining closely the abrasions on the palms and elsewhere, as well as the constriction marks on the neck and chest.
How many hours has he been dead?
Kyosuke rose and, with characteristic curiosity, put the question to the police physician standing nearby.
6 or 7 hours, I should say.
Then he was killed between 10 and 11 last night. And at about what time was he thrown down?
Judging from the blood left on the road and the state of coagulation around the wounds to the head, it must have been before 3 in the morning. There would have been people passing through that alley until at least midnight, so the possible interval is ultimately limited to somewhere between midnight and 3.
I agree. But why is the victim wearing pajamas? Was he not one of the men on night duty?
The police physician fell silent at Kyosuke's question. One of 6 pajama-clad employees who had until then been questioned by the chief judicial officer answered in the doctor's place.
Noguchi was on night duty last night. You see, This store has a peculiar rule or established practice, I suppose, under which employees from different departments take turns staying overnight. Among the sales staff, last night's duty fell to Noguchi, me, and the 5 men standing over there, 7 in all. Add the 3 maintenance men over there, and there were 10 of us on duty altogether. So even though we sleep in the same duty room, most of us scarcely know one another. What happened last night? As you know, we now remain open until night every evening. After closing, it takes a good 40 minutes for the place to become completely quiet. By the time we had divided up the work, checked all the doors, put out the lights, and gone to bed, it was nearly 10. Noguchi changed into his pajamas and seems to have gone out alone. I assumed he was going to the lavatory and thought nothing of it. After that, I slept soundly and knew nothing until a patrolman woke us at 4 this morning. Yes, the maintenance men's duty room is in the basement, and ours is at the back of the 3rd floor. The door from the 6th floor to the roof? No, we do not lock it.
When the employee had finished, Kyosuke asked the other 8 men on night duty whether any of them had anything to add about the previous night. None did. One man from the children's clothing department merely stated that a toothache had kept him awake until about 1. During that time he had not noticed at all that Tatsuichi Noguchi's bed was empty, nor had he heard any suspicious sound. Next, in response to Kyosuke's questions about the necklace, the manager of the jewelry department wiped the perspiration from his nose with a handkerchief and said,
I received the news only just now and came in at once. Quite shocked. Noguchi was a good man. What a terrible thing. He was certainly not the sort to earn anyone's hatred. The theft of the necklaces? I cannot believe Noguchi had anything to do with it. In any case, the necklaces disappeared at closing time 2 nights ago. These are the 2 pieces here, worth exactly 20,000 yen between them. From the circumstances, we concluded that the thief must have been among the customers. So not only the jewelry staff but every employee in the store was searched, and the entire building was combed from top to bottom. These last 2 days have been an uproar. And now this. It is utterly baffling.
Just as the manager finished, the vehicle for removing the body arrived. 3 maintenance men who had been on night duty lifted the corpse heavily and carried it away with fearful, unsteady steps. Kyosuke watched them for a while as though reluctant to see the body go. Then he turned, struck me on the shoulder, and cried briskly.
Come on. Let us go up to the roof.
Opening time was evidently near. From the elevator we could see that every department had filled with employees and salesgirls who had arrived unnoticed and were now busily folding the white printed cotton sheets that covered the merchandise or carrying out fresh goods. Presently we stepped onto the roof. Casting off the gloom of the scene below, I took deep breaths beneath the clear early autumn sky and looked down over the tiled roofs of the city spreading into the distance. Kyosuke walked to the northeast corner, from which Noguchi was believed to have fallen. He bent low to sight along the tiled floor, then thrust a hand into the 3-foot-wide planting bed that ran inside the iron fence around the perimeter and stirred the soil about the roots of the shrubs. Before long, with a complicated expression in his eyes, he spoke quietly to me. I had been absorbed by the sight of a keeper feeding a tiger in the western corner and a balloon attendant repairing an advertising balloon on the eastern terrace.
Are you watching the tiger? Let us go and get something to eat ourselves. This is turning into a very interesting case.
Kyosuke had already started away. At last he had taken up the case, I thought. Drawn by its deep fascination, I followed him down to the 6th floor. There I entered the telephone room and made the necessary report to my newspaper, fulfilling my duties as a reporter. Then Kyosuke and I went together to the restaurant. The restaurant was quiet, as one might expect at that hour of the morning. At a table by a corner window, however, the chief judicial officer and one of his subordinates were biting into thick sandwiches. As soon as he saw us, my cousin stood and brought chairs to the same table. We gladly sat down. When a waitress came to take our orders, Kyosuke, who had been studying the windows fitted with delicate iron grills, stopped her and confirmed that every window on every floor had the same kind of grill. When our meal arrived, the chief judicial officer began to talk between sips of hot tea.
The case is complicated, but solving it will be easy. I believe in examining the actual scene, you see. Now then, the murder was of course committed between 10 and 11 last night, and the body was thrown from the roof sometime between midnight and about 3 this morning. Both that interval and the fact that the building was securely locked, leaving no opportunity for an intruder, make it obvious that the killer was someone inside the store. To put it more plainly, someone who was in the building last night. I tell you this in confidence, of course, but I am about to investigate every man who was on night duty. The one troublesome matter is the necklace. If the person who stole it also murdered Noguchi, why abandon it? And if the victim himself stole it, what could have been the motive for murder? To resolve those questions, I shall begin by developing the fingerprints on the necklace. Well, enjoy your meal.
With a brisk farewell, the chief judicial officer left the restaurant, followed by his subordinate. Kyosuke, who until then had eaten in silence, showed a faint smile and spoke for the first time.
You said that man was your cousin, did you not? Well, never mind. The Japanese police in general are too eager to begin with the motive for a crime. When they encounter a case like this one, whose motive seems inexplicable even if only on the surface, they immediately make the case itself more complicated. There is nothing wrong with searching for a motive. I merely object to the simple, formula-bound mind that wants to regard motive as the sole clue available to a criminal investigator. To come to the point, the 3 features visible on the body matter more in this case than the affair of the pearls. First, the violence inflicted on the fatal constriction wound around the neck and the mark across the chest, which at first I mistook for a blow from some whip-like weapon, was extraordinarily powerful. Second, there were countless suspicious abrasions running crosswise across both palms, among them several calluses. Third, there were innumerable shallow abrasions on exposed places such as the shoulders, the underside of the jaw, and the elbows. Those are the 3. Let us first analyze the first clue. I immediately arrive at the inference that the assailant was either several people or one person of immense strength. Likewise, the second clue, the abrasions on the palms, clearly suggests that the victim gripped something tightly and rubbed his hands against it. Next, consider the third clue, the shallow abrasions scattered over his body. Those broad, rough marks, though superficial, were plainly not made by a knife or any other metal object. They point to something blunt and coarse, and moreover to the same weapon that abraded the palms, or one of identical character. That object, capable of producing such abrasions, was either present at the scene near the struggling victim or was carried directly by the assailant. In this instance, I believe the latter. Although the amount of force differed, these abrasions share the same essential character as the constriction marks on the neck and chest. Recall the victim's neck, where the earth-colored skin had been rubbed raw and was bleeding. Even the most elementary observation and reasoning should make it easy to see, from the absence of a narrow ligature groove and from the way the skin was torn, that the neck wound was caused by the same broad, coarse weapon that produced the second and third sets of abrasions. Accordingly, from examining each of these facts, I infer that the instruments responsible for all 3 classes of wound were in fact one and the same, the sole weapon used in the crime. The abrasions on the victim were not inflicted accidentally by some strange object lying at the scene during the struggle. They were made by a serpent-like weapon that attacked him relentlessly from the assailant's hands. Yet the most interesting feature for the next stage of the reasoning is the extraordinary abrasion of the palms. Surely you are not going to tell me that the dead man had been playing tug-of-war. There can likewise be no doubt that the countless shallow abrasions were minor injuries received in a struggle. Where, then, did that struggle, and therefore the crime, take place? I cannot believe the nonsense that someone murdered him outdoors, leaving such unmistakable signs of violence, then deliberately carried him inside and threw him from the roof to make the death look like a fall. Besides, the building was securely locked. What of the alternative, that the crime occurred inside the department store? To accept that interpretation, we would have to accept the astonishing fact that throughout the struggle leading to his death, the victim never once cried for help. The crime must therefore have been committed in the remaining place, the roof. That conclusion is admittedly commonplace, and the police would agree. But before reaching the same conclusion, I have at least explicitly ruled out one or two other possibilities. From the character of the fatal neck wound, for example, I concluded earlier that the assailant was either several people or a man of exceptional strength. My examination has now eliminated the first possibility. Among night duty employees organized as these were, a conspiracy is scarcely conceivable. We are left with one immensely powerful man. Who was that strong man?
This is becoming rather complicated. I had listened to Kyosuke's explanation in a kind of rapture, until at last my excitement burst out. Kyosuke lit a cigarette, drew one deep breath, and continued with shining eyes.
Complicated? No, my friend, it has become simpler. At the risk of sounding like Sherlock Holmes, once every impossibility has been eliminated, what remains is the truth. Now, the crime took place on the roof, and here we must remember that there were no footprints in the planting bed. Then we have the strange abrasions, especially those on the palms, an assailant of tremendous strength, and a relentless weapon. With these clues as our foundation, let us make one final investigation. Come, we shall buy a magnifying glass and go up to the roof again.
We rose and left the restaurant. Customers had entered unnoticed, and the place had returned to its ordinary bustle. From the musical instrument department below, cheerful jazz drifted gently upward through the stream of people crossing the gallery. After buying a medium-sized magnifying glass in the optical department on the 4th floor, we made our way through the crowds and returned to the roof. Perhaps because of the incident, ordinary customers had been barred. Only a few attendants were there, staring curiously at our intrusion. Kyosuke stood with his head tilted and deep furrows between his brows, casting a keen gaze from one end of the roof to the other. At length he motioned to me and returned to the northeast corner, where the body was thought to have fallen. Waving the magnifying glass, he inspected the iron fence and planting bed even more closely than before. Soon, however, he suddenly abandoned the spot. Muttering under his breath as if trying to summon something from memory, he walked toward the tiger cage on the west side. There he fell into deep thought while watching a large African male tiger doze listlessly. Then he wheeled around and looked toward one corner of the clear sky. His eyes sprang vividly to life, and he strode toward the terrace on the east side. On that terrace, a large gray advertising balloon was just beginning to rise ponderously into the pleasant blue sky, exposing its strange bulk. I drew an involuntary breath. To my surprise, Kyosuke stopped the attendant who had begun launching the balloon and subjected him to a cold interrogation.
What time did you come here this morning?
Well, the weather was rather poor last night, and I was worried because the balloon is my responsibility. So I reported at 6:30 this morning, a little earlier than usual.
The attendant answered amiably as he turned the winch handle in reverse.
Then you came out onto this terrace at 6:30?
No, sir. 6:30 was when I arrived at the store. Then I heard rumors about the incident and went to see the body, so it was already 7 when I came up here.
Did you notice anything unusual on the terrace then?
Nothing in particular, except that the gas hose had been thrown down carelessly. The balloon had lost a great deal of lift and was drifting very low, limp and almost ready to fall. But that often happens after rough weather.
Do you leave the balloon aloft during the night?
Usually we bring it down and tether it, yes. But sometimes we grow careless about the weather and leave it up.
What did you mean when you said the balloon had lost lift?
There was a hole in the envelope. It was a hole we had repaired once before, about a month ago.
I see. So that was why you were repairing the envelope a little while ago. By the way, how much lift does this balloon have?
Under standard atmospheric pressure, easily 600 kilograms.
600 kilograms? That is an enormous weight. Thank you.
His questions finished, Kyosuke watched the cutout advertising sign rise on the rope beneath the balloon. Just as the balloon reached its full height and the rope drew taut, the chief judicial officer arrived.
Well, gentlemen. Taking the air up here, are you? An excellent idea. In any case, what do you say to this? The fingerprints on the necklace were indeed Noguchi's. Look how clearly they developed.
With that, the chief judicial officer dangled the beautiful necklace before our eyes, flashing all the colors of the rainbow. Sure enough, 2 large finger marks stood out distinctly on its oversized pearls.
Splendid, Kyosuke said with a smile. Forgive me, but could you lend me a little of that powder, whatever it is, with the mercury and chalk mixed in?
He took the fingerprinting kit from the astonished officer, crouched beside the winch, and deftly scattered the gray powder over its handle. Then he brushed the excess away lightly with a camel hair brush.
Ah. I have only just remembered. When I brought the balloon down this morning to repair it, the valve on the gas inlet was standing open.
The attendant, who had been thinking in silence, suddenly spoke.
The valve was open?
Kyosuke looked up in apparent surprise and repeated the question. He remained lost in thought for a moment, then said to himself.
That is very powerful evidence.
He resumed his former posture and studied the surface of the handle through the magnifying glass as he addressed the attendant.
You touched this without gloves this morning, did you not?
Yes. When I first brought the balloon down, I was in a hurry to make the repairs.
Kyosuke then borrowed the necklace from the chief judicial officer and began comparing the prints developed on the handle with those on the necklace. I bent down beside him and studied both sets intently. I saw that the 2 groups of prints were entirely different.
You noticed it too, did you not? Look. Apart from this man's prints, there is not one impression on the handle matching those on the necklace, in other words, not one print belonging to the victim. That is all I needed. Now please bring the balloon down slowly.
The attendant gave Kyosuke a slightly puzzled look. Then he put on his work gloves and began turning the winch handle. 1 foot. 2 feet. The advertising balloon began to descend quietly. Kyosuke held the magnifying glass close to the rope as it wound in, directing a sharp gaze along its surface. When some 35 or 36 feet had been taken up, he stopped the balloon's descent and called to the chief judicial officer.
I have found the culprit.
His words startled us considerably. On the section of thick hemp rope to which he pointed, we saw a small quantity of black-red blood soaked deep into the fibers.
This is blood that flowed from the constriction wound on the victim's neck. Very well, we have finished with the balloon. Send it up, please. No, wait a moment. Bring it all the way down. I have forgotten one thing. I should like to test whether my conclusion is correct.
Still dumbfounded, the attendant began turning the crank again. The chief judicial officer stood with his teeth chattering from extreme excitement. His gaze shifted evenly between the slowly descending balloon, Kyosuke's profile, and the attendant's every movement. At last the balloon came all the way down and lay above our heads like some charming celestial body. Kyosuke opened the valve of the gas inlet, slipped his slender wrist inside, and searched the bottom of the envelope for a while. Presently he drew out a beautiful necklace.
The brazen devil!
The chief judicial officer made to spring upon the attendant.
Wait. You have the wrong man. The culprit is the balloon, this very balloon. Here, look at this.
Kyosuke dusted the gray powder onto three things, the metal fitting of the gas inlet, its valve, and the newly discovered necklace, and brushed it away. Several similar fingerprints appeared before our eyes on all three.
You see? Those are not this man's prints, are they?
They unquestionably belong to the victim, Tatsuichi Noguchi.
The chief judicial officer looked utterly bewildered. Kyosuke turned to me.
Would you mind telephoning the Central Meteorological Observatory and asking about the weather over Tokyo last night?
I obeyed, went down to the 6th floor, and placed the call from the telephone room. I recorded the answer in my notebook and returned to the roof. Kyosuke took the notebook from me.
Thank you. A low-pressure system measuring 753 millimeters of mercury, and a strong southwesterly wind. Very well, we are finished with the balloon now. Send it up. And now I shall explain my conclusion.
Having said this, Kyosuke lit a cigarette and looked up at the rising balloon. Then he began quietly.
First, I established 4 basic facts. 1. The culprit was a powerful man other than the employees on night duty. Remember here that the building was securely locked. 2. The crime was committed on the roof. Remember here the negative clue that no trace whatever appeared in the planting bed, on the iron fence, or on the tiled floor. 3. The sole weapon used in the crime was a long, freely flexible object with a coarse surface, in short, something like a rope. 4. The motive for the crime was not decisive. Starting with these materials, and applying my imagination as freely as possible under the strictest critical discipline, I embarked upon a new line of reasoning that brought the facts together. Before long I reached a hypothesis, still very rough in many respects, that made the balloons rope the weapon. To refine it, I came to this terrace and began gathering fresh evidence with which to test and organize my preliminary conclusion.
Here Kyosuke paused. He looked up once more at the advertising balloon and resumed in a louder voice.
Here is what happened. During business hours 2 nights ago, Tatsuichi Noguchi stole the 2 necklaces. Anticipating the inevitable body searches and the thorough search of the building, he hid them in the safest possible place, at the bottom inside the balloon. You do not guard the balloon at night, I take it, he asked, looking at the attendant. Good. Last night, perhaps because he was worried about the hidden necklaces, the victim, who happened to be on night duty, came up to the roof at about 10, before going to bed, to inspect the balloon. He found that its perforated envelope had lost lift and was hanging limp, almost ready to come down. Greatly alarmed, he hurriedly began hauling the balloon down hand over hand with all his strength. Even after losing some lift, the balloon, when filled with gas, was capable of lifting 600 kilograms. In his frenzy, the victim hauled it down, raising several calluses on his palms. He then opened the gas inlet valve and probably checked once that the stolen goods were safe. The uproar over the theft had not yet died down, so he naturally avoided the risk of removing them. Next he attached the gas hose and began replenishing the hydrogen. As the envelope filled, the balloon's lift increased. At this point, the victim had already made a grave mistake. In his alarm and haste when bringing the balloon down, he had hauled directly on the rope instead of using the winch. If the victim's fingerprints had appeared on the handle, apart, of course, from the prints left there by this attendant when he seized it without gloves in his hurry this morning, that would have refuted my inference. But none were found. Thus, While replenishing the gas and holding either the gas inlet fitting or the rope in his hands, the victim at last realized, as the balloon filled and its lift increased, the mistake he had made in not using the winch. Terrified, he must have tried frantically to catch the rope on some part of the winch and restrain the balloon's ascent. But the balloon, its lifting power restored, flung away the gas hose and began to rise mercilessly, leaving the valve open. The victim struggled desperately to restrain it. He tightened both hands around the rope, taking care not to let it lift his body. But the thick, coarse rope merely left countless abrasions on his palms as it raced upward. By the time the cutout advertising sign had flown into the air, his earlier mistake produced its terrible consequence. The length of rope he had hauled down and left coiled at his feet naturally tangled itself around his body as he thrashed about. He continued his frantic struggle. The rope made innumerable shallow abrasions on exposed places, the shoulders, the underside of the jaw, the elbows, tore the pajamas in one or two places, and then wound itself around his neck and chest. Unable to move, the victim was dragged bodily into the sky. When the balloon exhausted the momentum of its ascent and the rope snapped fully taut, his breathing stopped, a rib broke, and the skin of his neck was rubbed open and began to bleed. Tatsuichi Noguchi had quite literally ascended to heaven. Now then.
Kyosuke glanced at the notebook I had given him.
Between midnight and 2:30, a low-pressure system measuring 753 millimeters of mercury passed over Tokyo, accompanied by a strong southwesterly wind. It drove the balloon northeastward, away from its vertical line of ascent. The perforated balloon, aided by the passage of the low pressure, gradually lost lift. The tension in the rope slackened, and the victim's body was shaken loose, not onto the roof, but onto the asphalt in the alley northeast of the department store. The shock of the body falling dislodged one of the necklaces that had been pushed into the bottom of the envelope. It followed the dead man through the gas inlet, whose valve had been left open. Finally, as you no doubt know, the blood in a body killed by strangulation remains fluid for a comparatively long time. Thus, even though the corpse had hung from the rope for several hours after death, fresh blood flowed from its shattered head onto the asphalt when it fell.
Having finished, Kyosuke looked up at the sky once more. Against the beautiful blue September sky drifted the dreamlike advertising balloon, sharply outlined and gently quivering its underside in the passing breeze, the department store's strange hangman.
The Japanese Mystery Library. Classic mysteries from Japan in English. Subscribe to hear the next story.